In 2025, the peaceful communities of Edo State, Nigeria, were shattered by one of the most horrifying mass killings in recent history. Dozens lost their lives under mysterious and brutal circumstances, yet official answers remain scarce. This documentary dives deep into what really happened during the Edo State Massacre, from eyewitness accounts and survivor testimonies to the chilling silence of authorities. Was it political violence, a cult clash, or something far darker? Join us as we uncover hidden reports, shocking interviews, and the untold truths behind Nigeria's bloodiest night. Pushpin stay till the end for the full reconstruction of events, unseen evidence, and analysis of the motives that might have led to this tragedy. Backhand Index Pointing Right subscribe for more African true crime documentaries and real-life investigations. The night that shook Edo. It began like any other night in southern Nigeria, quiet, humid, and heavy with the smell of rain. But before dawn, Edo State would awaken to something unthinkable, a scene so violent, so chaotic, that it would stain the land's red soil with fear and confusion for years to come. Reports first surfaced from small communities near Uromi and Ekpoma, where villagers claimed to have heard shouting, gunfire, and screams that faded into the night. At first, no one believed it. In Nigeria, rumors moved faster than the truth. But by morning, the silence had become unbearable. When local police arrived, they found burned-out homes, bullet casings, and dozens of lifeless bodies. Men, women, even children, scattered across what once was a quiet neighborhood. No group claimed responsibility. No one stepped forward. And as the hours passed, questions replaced answers. Who were the attackers? Why were the victims targeted? And why did some witnesses insist they saw military uniforms, while others swore the killers came from a local cult group? The government called it an isolated act of violence. But the death toll kept changing from 20 to 40, then 60, and finally silence. Official updates vanished as quickly as they appeared. By week's end, the story was already being buried. Still, the people of Edo remembered, and in their stories, the truth began to fracture, told in whispers, fragments, and contradictions. Some said it was a revenge attack sparked by local land disputes. Others claimed it was politically motivated, a warning sent before the 2025 elections. But the most chilling version came from those who refused to sleep at night. The ones who spoke of strange lights, vehicles that vanished without a trace, and voices calling names in the dark hours before the killings began. What really happened in Edo that night? Who ordered the massacre? And why does every path to the truth end in silence or fear? This is the beginning of our investigation, a story of power, death, and mystery buried beneath layers of denial. Because in Edo State, truth doesn't disappear. It gets buried alive. The discovery, voices in the silence. When daylight finally broke over Edo State, it carried the weight of disbelief. The sun rose on a community frozen in shock, the quiet streets scattered with broken glass, blood, and questions no one dared to ask aloud. The first responders, local farmers and traders, were not police officers or journalists. They were neighbors searching for missing family members, guided only by the smell of smoke and the cries of survivors. By mid-morning, videos began to circulate online. Shaky phone footage showing abandoned vehicles, walls marked with bullet holes, and the distant echo of wailing. But something was off. Each clip seemed to vanish shortly after it was uploaded, leaving behind only rumors and blurred screenshots. Was someone trying to control the story before it spread? Or was it fear that silenced those who tried to tell it? When authorities finally arrived, their reports were contradictory. Some claimed it was a cult-related reprisal attack. Others labeled it a terror incident. Yet survivors told a very different story, one that didn't fit any official version. A woman from Uromi recalled seeing unmarked black trucks arriving just before midnight. A teenage boy claimed he heard men speaking a dialect not common to the area. Another witness swore the attackers wore masks and carried military-grade weapons. Each voice revealed a fragment of the truth. But together, they painted a picture of confusion and terror. When journalists tried to investigate, they found restricted access to the scene. Police warned them to avoid speculation. Local leaders called for calm, but refused to comment on who might be responsible. And as night returned to Edo, the survivors were left with nothing but fear and disbelief. Their homes were gone, their loved ones buried in shallow graves, and the truth locked behind silence. That night, villagers gathered to pray, some for peace, others for justice, and many for answers. But among them were whispers, stories of strange men seen near the outskirts, unfamiliar voices in the forest, and vehicles moving with no headlights long after curfew. No one knew if these stories were true, but they shared one thing. Every witness who spoke publicly disappeared within days. Coincidence? Or warning? Whatever happened in Edo that night, it was clear now. Someone didn't want the truth to be told. The vanishing files, a silence too organized. In the days that followed the Edo State Massacre, Nigeria's news cycle exploded. Headlines screamed, "Mass killing in Edo," and "Unknown gunmen strike again." But within a week, something strange began to happen. Stories disappeared, reports were retracted, and journalists who covered the killings suddenly went quiet. The massacre wasn't fading naturally from memory. It was being erased. Police files went missing from the local command office in Benin City. Digital copies of early witness statements were corrupted, and key evidence, ballistic reports, call logs, and CCTV footage simply vanished. Officials claimed it was a technical issue, but insiders whispered another word: cover-up. An anonymous police officer later told reporters that orders came from above to handle the case quietly and avoid unnecessary panic. When pressed about who gave the orders, he refused to answer. He disappeared from public view 2 weeks later, and so did the journalist who interviewed him. Across social media, hashtags tied to the massacre were shadowed, posts flagged for misinformation, and pages locked without explanation. The public grew suspicious, but without new evidence, the story slipped through Nigeria's fast-moving headlines. Only a few independent investigators kept digging. They uncovered inconsistencies, names of victims that appeared on 2 separate death lists, coordinates that didn't match the crime scene, and witness testimonies edited before publication. Something, or someone, was rewriting the history of Edo State. Meanwhile, families of the dead waited for justice that never came. They were told the investigation was ongoing, but there were no court hearings, no suspects, no arrests. It was as if the massacre had never happened. A grieving mother described it simply: "They killed my son twice, first in the night, then again when they erased his story." By mid-year, only one thing was certain: the truth had gone missing, and every person who tried to find it was being pulled into the same silence that swallowed the victims. What was powerful enough to make a whole massacre disappear? And why was no one brave enough to speak? The survivors, voices they tried to silence. Weeks after the massacre, while officials insisted the situation was under control, survivors were still hiding in fear. Most refused to speak on camera. Some had fled Edo entirely, vanishing into neighboring states, afraid that talking meant dying. Those who did speak spoke in whispers. They came just before midnight. No warning, no sirens, just trucks and flashlights. "We ran into the bush. When we came back, everything was gone." Her voice trembles, the sound of rain masking her sobs. Behind her, the camera lingers on the remains of her home, walls blackened by fire, a child's shoe half buried in the dirt. Another man, once a motorbike rider, showed scars running down his back, shrapnel wounds from the night of the attack. He said the attackers called out names, as if searching for specific people. When asked why, he only said, they knew who they came for. These stories might have been dismissed as rumor, except that each survivor's account matched the same pattern: the trucks, the timing, the weapons, and the silence that followed. Yet each time one of them tried to speak publicly, the threats began again. Anonymous calls, strange vehicles parked outside their homes. 2 witnesses were later reported missing. And just like that, their story stopped too. Why were survivors being silenced? Who feared what they might reveal? A confidential report from a local NGO claimed that some survivors identified one of the attackers, a man once linked to a political campaign militia. But before the report could be published, the NGO's office was raided, and their data drives were seized. No one was charged. No one spoke again. Still, the people of Edo refused to forget. Churches held prayers. Mothers gathered weekly at the burnt remains of their community hall, not to protest, but to remember. They said each candle lit was a voice that the killers tried, but failed to silence. And yet, every story leads to the same question. How can justice begin when those who lived to tell the truth are being hunted for speaking it? The survivors have spoken. But now, to find the truth, we must follow the power behind the silence. The power lines, politics, power, and the hidden hands behind Edo's night of blood. This will peel back the political and institutional layers, showing how influence, fear, and corruption shaped the cover-up. The power lines, politics, power, and the hands behind the blood. Narrator: every tragedy leaves a trail, not just of blood, but of influence. In an Edo State, that trail led to the one place survivors feared to name, the corridors of power. After the massacre, statements from officials were brief, cautious, and almost identical. They condemned the killings, promised investigations, and said little else. But behind closed doors, whispers began to spread that this was never just a random act of violence. A source from within the local Security Council described tension between rival political camps ahead of the 2025 elections. One side was rumored to have been funding private militias for protection. The other, arming vigilantes under the guise of community defense. And somewhere between those lines, innocent people died. But the most chilling revelation came from a leaked internal memo, marked confidential security brief. It listed several high-risk areas days before the massacre, including the very villages that were later attacked. No action had been taken. The warnings were ignored. Was this negligence or design? They knew something was coming. The reports were on their desks. But when you mention certain names, people suddenly forget how to read. He claimed elements within local power circles sabotaged the response, not to protect the people, but to protect their own. Funding trails were traced from shell companies to private security outfits operating without licenses. Some of those same names appeared in Edo's political donor lists. The deeper the investigation went, the darker it became. Officials who once promised transparency stopped returning calls. Records disappeared. One investigator received a message that simply read, "Stop asking questions about Edo." 2 days later, his car was found abandoned along the Benin-Auchi Expressway. It was no longer just about the massacre. It was about the machinery that allowed it to happen, and the silence that followed. Some called it corruption. Others called it fear. But the truth looked more like a pact, an unspoken agreement between those who gain power and those who enforce it. In Edo, justice was no longer about who fired the guns. It was about who gave permission and who had the power to make the evidence disappear. The deeper we look, the more one thing becomes clear. This wasn't chaos. It was control. Echoes in the dust, the media, the myths, and the fight to keep the story alive. Every tragedy has two deaths, one in blood and one in memory. After the Edo State Massacre, the second death came quietly. As weeks turned into months, the headlines disappeared, and only fragments remained. Whispers on social media, deleted news clips, and a faint echo of outrage. But some refused to let the silence win. One of them was Tiga Osazi, a 27-year-old reporter from Benin City. She had been covering political violence for years, but the Edo massacre changed everything. In her last published article, she wrote, "If the truth is not told, it will haunt those who buried it." 2 days later, her office was broken into. Her laptop, the only copy of her notes, was gone. Tiga was never seen again. She wasn't the only one. At least 4 independent bloggers and journalists vanished or went silent after reporting on Edo. Their pages were locked, videos removed, and archives wiped from search engines. But in digital corners of Nigeria's online space, fragments of their work survived. reposted, encrypted, and reshared under anonymous accounts. Screenshots of deleted tweets, audio clips from police radios, pieces of a truth too dangerous to stay public. And then came the myths. Stories spread across Edo about ghosts seen near the massacre sites, phones ringing from disconnected numbers, and voices crying out in the forest after midnight. Were they superstition or warning? Locals believed the spirits of the victims refused to rest because their killers still walked free. In night markets and roadside bars, the story was retold 100 ways, until truth and fear became one. Meanwhile, a small coalition of journalists and human rights workers formed an underground group they called Project Echo. Their goal? To preserve the files, names, and coordinates linked to the massacre. Before everything was wiped out completely, they stored the data on encrypted drives hidden in different states. One of the files contained a list of alleged masterminds, but no one could verify it because anyone who touched the evidence vanished. Rumor says one of those drives was last seen in Lagos, carried by an unnamed whistleblower who disappeared en route to a foreign embassy. To this day, that file has never resurfaced. Massacre may have ended in one night, but the battle for truth still rages, in whispers, in encrypted files, in the minds of those who remember. And like the dust that coats Edo's red earth, the story refuses to settle. Because in Nigeria, silence is never empty. It's filled with the echoes of those who dared to speak. The cover and the cost, those who paid for the truth. By late 2025, the Edo State Massacre was no longer just a story. It was a warning to journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who dare to question what really happened that night. For some, that question would cost everything. One of them was Kelvin Ayamu, a freelance photojournalist. He had captured some of the earliest images from the massacre scene. Photos of bodies lined along the roadside, police officers standing idle, and military trucks parked without plates. When he tried to publish the pictures, the outlet received a government notice demanding national security clearance. Days later, Kelvin's home was raided. His cameras were seized. The next morning, his car was found on the outskirts of the city, doors open, engine running. Kelvin was gone. He was 29 years old. His friends still keep his last message. If something happens to me, the truth is on the memory card. That card was never recovered. Kelvin wasn't alone. Human rights lawyers, pastors, and even community chiefs who spoke too loudly about the massacre began receiving anonymous threats. A few were attacked on dark roads by unknown men. Others were arrested under false charges, inciting unrest, spreading misinformation, defaming authorities. Justice, it seemed, had a price tag. Behind the scenes, international organizations began asking questions. Amnesty International, the Committee to Protect Journalists, local NGOs. But each time the story neared global attention, it was redirected, delayed, or drowned by other headlines. The system didn't deny the massacre. It just made people forget. A confidential source from within the state government admitted, "We were told not to make the state look unstable." The truth was bad for business. That single sentence summed up the tragedy. Truth had become a political liability, but there were still those who refused to stay quiet. Families of the victims began organizing silent marches through Benin City. No placards, no chants, just candles and the names of the dead whispered aloud. One night, during a vigil, power to the entire street was cut. By morning, the wall that once carried the victims' names had been painted over. White paint. Fresh. Still wet. The message was clear. Erase, forget, move on. But the people didn't. Not this time. The cost of truth in Edo wasn't just measured in fear or silence. It was measured in lives. Those who died that night, and those who vanished trying to tell their story. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of lies and paint, the truth still breathes, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. Because every cover-up leaves a crack, and through that crack, light eventually finds its way. Return to the red earth, following the ghosts of Edo. Months after the massacre, the red earth of Edo still held its silence. But silence, as the locals say, is never empty. Every road, Every patch of scorched ground seemed to whisper something, not just of what happened, but of what refused to stay buried. We returned to the villages, places left untouched since the night of the killings. The people who had fled slowly trickled back, carrying both hope and fear in equal measure. One woman, Mama Iobosa, led us through what used to be her home. The floor was cracked from heat. The air smelled of dust and smoke. She stopped by a patch of earth and said quietly, "They try to wash the blood away, but every time it rains, it comes back up." Her words weren't metaphor. The red earth itself, rich in iron and clay, bled when wet. Rain begins to fall on cracked soil. Streaks of deep red flow across the ground. To her and many others, the ground was alive, a witness that refused to forget. Some nights, villagers reported strange lights near the old fields. Others said they heard drums echoing in the distance long after midnight. No music, no ceremonies, just rhythms that seemed to come from nowhere. To investigators, they were echoes of trauma. To the villagers, they were the voices of the dead still walking. Our ancestors warned that when the innocent die in vain, the land will cry until justice is done. Look around. The land is still crying. Investigative tone returns. Whether you believe the stories or not, the fact remained. Evidence from the massacre site was still missing. Weapons, shell casings, and even official reports had vanished. But the people hadn't forgotten where each gunshot fell. Using locals' memories, investigators retraced the pattern of the attack. And what they found was chilling. The attackers moved with military precision. Same formation, same routes, same exit points. This wasn't spontaneous violence. It was an operation. Every route led to the same clearing. A wide stretch of red sand near the Ovia River. That's where dozens of bodies were said to have been buried. When a private investigation team visited the area, they found freshly covered ground, but no official record of any excavation. Just tire marks and the lingering smell of gasoline. One of the villagers whispered. They came back at night to erase what was left. Who they were remains a mystery. But the site, now fenced off and declared restricted for security reasons, stands as both grave and symbol. The point where truth was buried, and the ghosts of Edo began to rise. You can cover blood with sand, paint over names on walls, silence the witnesses, but the land remembers. And in Edo, the land itself tells the story that the world was never meant to hear. The question is, will anyone listen before it happens again? The silence of the state when justice fails the dead. Justice, they said, would come, but in Edo, justice arrived late. And when it did, it came blindfolded. After the massacre, an official inquiry was announced. Committees were formed, photographs were taken, statements were collected. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe the truth would finally see daylight. But then, the silence began. Weeks passed, then months. The victims' names vanished from government briefings. The inquiry panel missed deadlines, lost documents, and eventually stopped meeting altogether. A year later, the state released a report, thin, vague, and riddled with contradictions. It mentioned communal tensions, armed miscreants, and unverified casualties. But nowhere did it name the people who gave the orders. Sir, are you confirming that the perpetrators were linked to local security forces? We cannot speculate. The matter is under review. That phrase, under review, became the government's shield. A wall of bureaucracy built from paperwork and silence. Inside the Ministry of Justice, sources claimed the original witness list had been edited, reducing over 80 names to just 12. Some testimonies were labeled unreliable. Others were erased completely. Among those removed, a police officer who had reported being ordered to stand down the night of the killings. He later went missing. When justice is filtered through power, truth becomes optional. And for the families who waited, mothers, widows, children, the silence was a second death. Many gathered weekly outside the court in Benin City, holding photos of their loved ones. No one from the government ever joined them. They took his body, then they took his name, but they will not take my voice. Her voice cracked, not with fear, but with exhaustion. The tragedy of Edo wasn't just the massacre. It was what came after, the silence dressed in procedure, the endless committees with no outcomes, the justice that never reached the graves. Out of more than 40 suspects initially arrested, only 3 were ever charged. All were released on bail. None were convicted. The rest? Unknown gunmen, a phrase that had become a shield for every unsolved atrocity. They say history repeats itself when truth is ignored. But in Edo, history doesn't repeat, it lingers. In the courts, in the silence of files that were never opened, and in the hearts of those still waiting to hear the word justice. For them, the silence of the state was louder than any gunshot. This one explores how citizen journalists, YouTubers, and online activists resurrected the Edo story through social media and underground footage. The rise of the digital resistance against censorship. The echo chamber, truth seekers, and the digital resistance. When the government turned off the microphones, the people turned on their phones. The story of the Edo State Massacre was supposed to fade into the archives. Another tragedy buried beneath bureaucracy and fear. But in the digital age, silence doesn't last long. Someone is always recording. It began quietly. A few anonymous Twitter accounts posting grainy footage of the attack. Then came voice notes, WhatsApp forwards, and live streams. Each fragment told a story the official report refused to tell. One video, a blurry clip of gunfire echoing near a marketplace, went viral overnight. It wasn't clear who filmed it, but within 24 hours, it had over 2 million views. And just like that, Edo was no longer a local story. It had become a digital movement. The government called it fake news, but people had already seen enough to know it wasn't. Online communities began archiving every deleted video, every leaked memo. They built a digital memorial, a living archive of names, images, and testimonies. Even when posts were taken down, copies reappeared elsewhere, shared across VPNs and cloud drives. It was no longer about journalism. It was resistance. They shut down the papers, but they can't shut down everyone's phone. We became the media. We became the record. In a world where truth can be deleted, preserving it becomes an act of rebellion. Through encrypted channels, whistleblowers sent documents showing links between private contractors and government offices. Some accounts were suspended. Others were hacked. But the files survived, copied, reposted, re-uploaded endlessly. The truth had learned how to multiply. Even celebrities and international NGOs joined the chorus. What had begun as grief now became global pressure, and for the first time in months, officials in Edo State couldn't hide behind silence, because the world was watching. Her name was Rita Asamoah, a university student and aspiring filmmaker. She started a YouTube series called The Shadows of Edo, re-editing leaked clips with survivor testimonies and narrating them in her mother tongue. Her videos reached thousands before they were removed. Her final upload ended with just 3 words on a black screen. They can't kill truth. A week later, her account disappeared. To this day, no one knows what happened to Rita, but her work remains, mirrored, saved, and shared by strangers who refuse to forget. The digital resistance became her voice, and through it, Edo found something the government never expected: immortality through memory. The truth had escaped the courtroom, broken free from dusty files, and taken shelter in a cloud, beyond reach, beyond borders, where no order or threat could erase it. Because sometimes, justice doesn't start in a court. It starts in a comment section. The living and the lost, survivors' stories, and the price of memory. In every tragedy, there are 2 kinds of people: the ones who die and the ones who live to remember. In Edo, both carry the same burden. Months after the massacre, survivors began to speak. Not to police, not to journalists, but to each other, in hushed voices around cooking fires, in market corners, in churches where the hymns trembled with grief. They weren't just telling stories. They were rebuilding history. I saw them coming through the dust. They had guns, but no faces. They called out my husband's name before they fired. Her eyes drifted to the ground. a small patch of earth where she still lays flowers each morning. Her husband's body was never recovered, but to her that spot is sacred. The land remembers what the system forgot. We ran. I don't know how I survived. I was hiding behind that wall. My friend didn't make it. He turns his face away from the camera. Silence stretches, the kind that says more than words ever could. The survivors of Edo don't ask for pity. They ask for memory, because forgetting, to them, is another kind of death. Every time they retell their story, they relive it, but they also reclaim it. Faith became their shelter. Every Sunday, candles burn for those who never came home. Their names are spoken like prayers, a ritual of remembrance that refuses to fade. In these gatherings, the massacre isn't a headline. It's a living wound, shared, carried, and healed together. Children too young to understand still draw what they saw. A teacher holds up a picture, a child's crayon outline of the night that changed everything. She said that's where her father went to sleep. The teacher whispers, but he never woke up. Psychologists call it collective trauma. But in Edo, it's something deeper, a shadow that follows, a voice that whispers through generations. Yet even in the pain, there's something unbreakable, a quiet defiance. They rebuild, not because the past is gone, but because life insists on continuing. In every brick laid, in every name whispered, in every story told again and again, they are keeping the dead alive, not as ghosts, but as reminders of what truth costs, and why it must never be silenced. The living and the lost now walk the same roads, one in flesh, one in memory, and in their footsteps, the story of Edo continues, not just as tragedy, but as testimony, because sometimes survival itself is the loudest form of justice. The weight of the dead, secrets buried beneath the state. In Edo, truth doesn't disappear. It's buried, and beneath the red earth, under fields and forests, lie the answers no one dares to dig up. For months after the massacre, there were whispers of unmarked graves, missing trucks, and nighttime excavations that took place long after journalists had gone home. But the whispers wouldn't stay quiet forever. A group of independent investigators, calling themselves the Witness Collective, began mapping coordinates based on survivor testimonies. Each red dot on the map marked a place where gunfire was heard, or bodies were last seen. But one cluster stood out, a large clearing by the Ovia River, officially labeled Agricultural Storage Zone. No farms, no warehouses, just red sand. Satellite data showed the earth had been disturbed, dug up, flattened, and recovered within 48 hours of the massacre. But when investigators arrived, they found fresh security fences, government warning signs, and patrol vehicles stationed nearby. It wasn't a farm. It was a secret. One of the investigators, a local pastor named Reverend Osato, recorded a voice note that would later leak online. We found something, metal casings, cloth, maybe human bones. But soldiers came. They told us this area was now property of the state. 2 days later, Reverend Osato was arrested. The charge, trespassing on government land. He was released weeks later, but refused to speak again. The graves are real. They moved the bodies before international observers arrived. Everything was classified as an emergency cleanup. According to the insider, a private security company oversaw the cleanup, one already linked to political donors. Its trucks, its men, its orders, all signed off by higher authorities. This wasn't concealment by chance. It was strategy. When activists filed Freedom of Information requests, the government responded with heavily censored pages. Whole sections blacked out, dates missing, signatures erased. The silence wasn't accidental. It was official. The weight of the dead doesn't just rest beneath the soil. It presses on the conscience of a nation. It haunts those who know what lies below, but choose not to speak. Every unmarked grave is a chapter the world was never meant to read. Locals say that when the wind is strong, you can still hear the ground hum, a low sound like a heartbeat, as if the earth itself remembers. Maybe it's superstition, or maybe it's truth refusing to stay buried. Either way, the land keeps its secrets, and secrets, like the dead, never stay silent forever. The men who knew too much, the shadows that still walk. Every story has its villains. But in Edo, they didn't wear masks or hide in forests. They wore suits. They smiled for cameras. And they signed documents that rewrote the truth. For months, the investigation pointed toward men whose names never appeared in print. Men who controlled contracts, commanded security units, and silenced witnesses. They were the architects of silence. And they built their empire from fear. In a country where power means protection, these men learned that truth could be bought, and memory could be erased. But every secret leaves fingerprints. Leaked bank documents showed money transfers to community security consultants. Some of those same accounts were later tied to political campaign funds. The paper trail was faint, but it was there, and the closer investigators came, the quieter everyone became. We knew who gave the orders. We just couldn't say it on record. Because in Edo, truth can cost your life. They called them the Circle, a network of politicians, contractors, and security heads who moved in unison when danger came close. Phone records showed calls between offices the night of the massacre, meetings that were never logged, memos that vanished within hours. They didn't just cover up the crime. They managed it. Years later, one of the key insiders fell ill and began to talk. He spoke of orders delivered over encrypted lines, of containment plans, of promises made to keep the public calm. He died before his testimony reached the court. Heart attack, they said, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. And so, the men who knew too much simply disappeared back into their offices, untouched, unpunished, their faces smiling on billboards during the next election. But even shadows leave traces. For every lie they told, a new generation of truth seekers rose online, armed not with guns, but with cameras and courage. They call themselves the keepers of the Red Earth. Students, teachers, survivors. People who refused to let the story die. The massacre was never just about bullets and blood. It was about the power to erase and the fight to remember. Edo's story doesn't end with justice. It ends with awareness. Because every time it's told, the silence breaks a little more. They buried the truth beneath the red earth. But the ground remembers. And one day, when the wind is right, the names they tried to erase will rise again, spoken, shared, and unforgotten. Because the dead are never truly gone, as long as the living refuse to forget. In memory of all those lost in the Edo State Massacre, and to those still searching for the truth.